Winter, like an ominous premonition, enveloped Wessex, and torches burned dimly on the walls of Anglo-Saxon strongholds. King Edward, heir to a dynasty whose ancestors had forged this kingdom with blood and iron, dreamed of more, of conquering the northern lands. The Vikings seemed to him a plague, barbarians who needed to be expelled from Christian soil. Yet he had no idea that in the very heart of his kingdom, something sinister was brewing in the shadows. Among the ordinary townsfolk, blacksmiths, and even monks of Wessex, there lurked individuals with cold eyes and ruthless hearts, patiently awaiting their moment. They were part of a secret order, a silent brotherhood aiming to overthrow Edward and thwart his plans for northern invasion. At their head stood a man whose name was whispered among allies and struck fear into enemies. He lived among the Anglo-Saxons as one of them, but his soul belonged to the old gods. The court of Wessex reveled in carefree jubilation, confident in its invincibility, while coded messages were secretly relayed between ports and villages. Every detail was meticulously planned so that when the hour came, the flames of rebellion would engulf the kingdom from within. The war had not yet begun, but in the quiet of the conspiracy, its outcome was already predetermined. Wessex was not merely a kingdom, but a symbol of Anglo-Saxon resistance against foreign invaders. For generations, its kings had raised walls against the Danes, witnessed their towns burn, and their battles became legends. In his time, Alfred the Great had strengthened the kingdom, driving back the Vikings and laying the foundations of a unified England. Now, years later, his grandson, Edward the Elder, bore the burden of his lineage. He sought not only to defend Wessex, but also to expand its borders. For Edward, the war against the Norsemen was not a matter of defense, but of destiny. His kingdom was powerful, yet not impregnable. The lands of Wessex were renowned for their wealth, thriving villages, and stone fortresses where lords, loyal to the king, ruled with an iron fist. Monasteries safeguarded treasures and ancient manuscripts, and peasants diligently tilled the land, supporting the king's war machine. However, beneath this veneer of stability, cracks were forming. Some nobles doubted the king's obsession with expanding borders. Others feared that endless wars would drain the royal treasury. And there were those who, in dark taverns and secret chambers, whispered that the Norsemen's revenge was closer than Edward imagined. However, the king ignored the voices of doubt. His gaze was fixed on the north, where Viking clans still ruled, refusing to bow to his authority. He considered it a personal insult. The pagan gods had to be vanquished, and the icy lands of the Norsemen had to belong to the English crown. Edward had no idea that the enemy had already infiltrated his kingdom and was waiting for the opportune moment. Every decision he made was under close scrutiny, and every weakness would be exploited against him at the most opportune time. The game had begun, and Wessex, which seemed so unshakable, might not be as impregnable as the king believed. Akin was no ordinary warrior. Born amidst the clangor of battles and hardened by sea voyages, he understood that brute force did not always bring victory. True triumph belonged to those who knew how to wait, who infiltrated the shadows to deliver the decisive blow. His order, known as the Sons of Fenrir, comprised the most cunning and deadly Norse warriors. However, they did not present themselves as invaders. On the contrary, they came under the guise of redemption, pretending to have renounced the old gods and embraced the Christian faith. They dressed as merchants and warriors, weary from endless battles, people seeking a new life under the protection of King Edward. But behind their submissive appearance and humble words lay one truth: they had not come to submit. Over time, their influence grew. Akin and his men established themselves in strategically important towns, offering their services as loyal mercenaries to the crown and earning the trust of local lords. They participated in feasts, guarded caravans, and even helped suppress minor revolts. King Edward saw them as proof that pagans could be converted, a symbol of his superiority over the Norsemen. But while the king remained in his overconfidence, the sons of Fenrir sowed the seeds of rebellion. Rumors spread in every tavern, an ally appeared in every village, and a spy was found in the castle. The plan was simple. When the time came, Wessex would be engulfed in flames from within. The gates would be opened by the kingdom's own inhabitants, weary of endless war. Discontented lords would be presented with a choice. And when Edward realized the betrayal, it would be too late. The siege would begin not with a breach of walls, but with the breakdown of ties and the dissolution of alliances. And then Akin would claim what was rightfully his. But for this, he had to patiently play his part, for a king's downfall begins not with the strike of an axe, but long before, in the silence of doubt and the poison of distrust. Akin was born under a sky clouded by the smoke of battle in a coastal village in the harsh north. His father, Sigvald, was a powerful jarl, known for his ferocity in combat and ruthless wisdom. His mother, Freya, was a skald whose words carried the power of the ancient gods. From an early age, Akin learned that glory and death were inseparable, and that a man without purpose was merely a walking dead man awaiting his grave. Akin's childhood was no different from that of other young warriors. He grew up listening to tales of Odin and Thor, of lords who conquered worlds, and of heroes who defied fate itself. However, unlike his peers, Akin did not merely dream of strength, he craved to inspire fear. While others honed their combat skills, he practiced the art of command. He observed the elders, learned from the mistakes of his predecessors, and absorbed every lesson, like molten metal being forged in a smithy. His baptism of fire came early. At the age of 12, he accompanied his father on a raid against an enemy clan. Too young to fight on the front lines, he was, nevertheless, old enough to smell the stench of blood. That day, he witnessed a man pierced by a spear, his soul leaving its mortal coil. The dying man's vacant gaze was etched into his memory. He felt neither pity nor fear, only curiosity. What makes a warrior fall? What gives him the strength to stand? This question haunted him for years. Akin grew into a ruthless warrior. By 17, he had claimed more lives than many jarls in their entire lifetime. But what set him apart was not just physical strength, but a keen mind. He understood that war was not just about swords and axes, but also about patience, strategy, and the art of manipulation. Then tragedy struck. One dark night, his village was attacked by warriors sent by King Harald, who sought to consolidate his power over the northern clans. His father fell in battle, his mother was taken into slavery, and Akin was left for dead, wounded, amidst the ruins of their burning home. Yet death did not claim him. He crawled from the ashes and vowed, from now on, he would fight only for himself. From that day, Akin became a lone wolf. He wandered between settlements, hiring himself out as a mercenary, learning the art of war from various people. He spent time in Ireland, where he learned the secrets of Celtic spies. In his travels, he heard about England and how pliable the Saxons were, how their faith blinded them, preventing them from seeing the true nature of war. He saw an opportunity. If the Saxons could be deceived by gods and empty promises, perhaps they could be deceived by something far greater. After years of training, Akin returned to the north, but not to be a mere warrior. He returned to create something new. He gathered around him those who, like him, had been betrayed by kings and gods, those who had lost families, were exiled, and had no homeland but hatred and a thirst for revenge. He gave them a purpose, not just to raid, but to conquer, not just to fight, but to infiltrate. He named them the Sons of Fenrir, after the monstrous wolf destined to devour the gods on the day of Ragnarok. For, like Fenrir, Akin and his men would not be content with small spoils. They would devour entire kingdoms. Disguised in sheep's clothing, they crossed the sea and landed in Wessex. They presented themselves as repentant Norse warriors seeking a new life under the patronage of King Edward. They knew that the Saxons considered Vikings barbarians, but also potential converts to Christianity. Akin used this to his advantage. With cleverly chosen words and measured actions, he began to sow the seeds of the king's downfall, for a good warrior can win a battle, but only a strategist can overthrow an empire. The sons of Fenrir were not just warriors, they were shadows gliding among the Anglo-Saxons, wolves in sheep's clothing. Created by a kin, the order emerged from the necessity to organize a structured and deadly resistance to Christian dominion. Unlike the impulsive Viking raids and chaotic forays, the sons of Fenrir were guided by strict principles inspired by the wolf itself, the god of destruction. Their oath was simple: loyalty to a brother, blood for blood, absolute silence. Betrayal was punishable by death. Recruits underwent brutal trials, enduring unbearable pain, hunger, and cold to temper body and spirit. They infiltrated villages, studied customs, feigned conversion to Christianity, mapping fortresses, studying supply routes, and earning the trust of Saxon nobles. Their weapon was not only strength but also cunning. They hired themselves out as mercenaries to landowners, swore fealty to King Edward, joined his personal guard, and relayed valuable information to their secret brothers. Their tasks included poisoning Saxon commanders, arson of strategically important targets, and gradually weakening Wessex's defenses. The order communicated using symbols carved on wood and bone, encrypted messages that only the initiated could decipher. The sons of Fenrir's connection to Ubbe Ragnarsson was a closely guarded secret. Ubbe, son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, burned with a thirst for revenge for his father's death and sought to expand Norse influence in England. He saw Akin's order as a potent weapon. For years, Ubbe secretly funded their operations, supplying gold, weapons, and valuable information. The sons of Fenrir were not just soldiers for his cause, but vengeful spirits of Odin's lineage, ready to end Edward's reign and turn Wessex into a Viking domain. The noose was tightening, but one mistake could ruin everything. Night enveloped the land in an icy blanket. Stars, like shards of celestial mirrors, scattered across the dark canvas, but in the heart of Wessex, the silence was broken only by the ominous whisper of the wind, carrying biting snow through the twisted trees. St. Oldhelm's Monastery, a solitary bastion of faith, stood on the bank of a narrow river, like a stone fortress guarding its secrets. Beneath its calm facade, a sinister secret was brewing. Its impregnable walls were preparing to receive a Viking detachment led by Ubbe Ragnarsson, whose audacious goal was the conquest of the very heart of the Kingdom of Wessex. Within the walls of this ancient monastery, the sons of Fenrir were to reveal their true power to the world. St. Oldhelm served not only as a refuge for monks and a place of spiritual retreat, but also held strategic importance as a crucial supply point for the Wessex army. King Edward, consumed by ambitious expansion plans, had stationed a small garrison of Saxon warriors here, tasked with guarding the peace of the region and thwarting any Viking incursions. The garrison commander, Eald, was a stern and vigilant man, confident in his abilities, but he was about to underestimate those who had already infiltrated his territory. Akin, leader of the sons of Fenrir, was keenly aware of this. He meticulously planned every detail of the operation, from the silent infiltration of the region to the deployment of forces at the moment of attack. The Order, which had hitherto operated in the shadows, was preparing to unleash its full fury on a cold winter night. The Order received a final coded message from Ubbe Ragnarsson, informing them of the redeployment of Wessex troops to a distant town for a battle, which made the monastery particularly vulnerable. This was the perfect moment for the sons of Fenrir to seize control and begin the bloody siege of Wessex. As 0 hour approached, Akin gathered his best warriors. They knew well what was at stake. The attack had to be swift and lethal, driven by a relentless goal to destroy King Edward and establish Viking rule over the Anglo-Saxon lands. The monastery, despite its impressiveness and surrounding dense forests, was unprepared for a stealth attack. The river, once a natural barrier to invasion, now became a strategic advantage. The warriors of the Sons of Fenrir, hardened in night battles, used small, silent boats, equipped only with oars and sails, to silently cross the water and approach the monastery. Meanwhile, within the monastery walls, Saxon soldiers, convinced that the Viking threat had passed, indulged in the tranquility of the night. Many rested after a long day of patrolling, while others had already fallen asleep, lulled by the thought of security in this sacred place. But Akin and his sons of Fenrir knew that overconfidence was the greatest mistake an army could make. The plan was simple. The sons of Fenrir would infiltrate the monastery under the cover of night and seize it with one swift strike. Akin, standing at the forefront with a broadsword in hand and a wolf's head carved on his belt, gave the signal to attack. With a silent battle cry, his warriors surged forward. The first and most crucial phase of the strategy was the elimination of the sentries on the monastery towers. The sons of Fenrir, like shadows, used ropes and ladders to scale the walls, catching the guards by surprise and neutralizing them before they could raise the alarm. Simultaneously, a small detachment was sent to the granary, where food and supplies were stored. Their goal was to set the area ablaze and sow panic. The intention was to create chaos and force the Saxon soldiers to disperse while the main objectives of the mission were carried out. The moment of shock came suddenly, like a bolt from the blue. By the time the sons of Fenrir burst into the monastery's main hall, the battle was in full swing. Steel blades cut through the air, the smell of blood and sweat mingling with the scent of incense that permeated the stone vaults. The monks, peaceful and devout, were caught off guard. Some tried to hide in the inner chambers, while others, overcome by terror, could barely beg for mercy. But for Akin and his warriors, there was no mercy. The sons of Fenrir had come with one purpose: to seize the monastery and use its strategic position for their further campaigns. The fighting within the monastery was particularly ferocious. The Vikings' mastery of hand-to-hand combat and their unyielding will, forged in training, became the decisive factor. Akin, maintaining his unruffled composure, was the first to storm the great prayer hall where the Saxon soldiers had gathered to discuss their next moves. The element of surprise was so potent that many soldiers did not have time to react. Wielding his sharp sword, Akin carved a path through the enemy ranks, sending them one by one to the next world. Beside him, his order's warriors fought fiercely, ruthless men born for war. In the thick of the battle, Eald, the Saxon commander, tried to rally his forces and mount a counterattack, but the suddenness of the assault and the general disorganization caught him off guard. In a desperate attempt to defend the monastery, he ordered his soldiers to form a defensive line around the main entrance. However, Akin had already studied every corner and every weak point of the fortress. A second unit of the Sons of Fenrir, having taken strategically advantageous positions on the towers, began showering the building with incendiary arrows, setting parts of it ablaze and sowing even greater chaos among the Saxons. With the first glimmer of dawn on the horizon, the monastery appeared as smoking ruins. The ground was thickly strewn with the lifeless bodies of Saxon warriors and monks, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and death. However, despite the horrifying scene, the Vikings' mission was far from over. In Akin's cold and unwavering eyes, there was an anticipation of the next task. This was not just a bloody battle, but a meticulously planned strategic maneuver on the path to complete dominance over Wessex. The capture of the monastery was merely the first stage in a long and bloody campaign. Ubbe Ragnarsson's forces, heir to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, were due to arrive at the fortified monastery, now under the control of the sons of Fenrir. This audacious raid was not only a military victory, but also an ominous harbinger that the Vikings intended to capture Wessex step by step, gradually weakening the kingdom until it finally fell under the invaders' onslaught. Haakon was confident that with Ubbe's help, he could overthrow King Edward and subject the Anglo-Saxon lands to the rule of the sons of Fenrir. The monastery, now a Viking stronghold, was to become a symbol of resistance. Its strategic location and rich resources would play a decisive role in the sons of Fenrir's future actions. The siege of Wessex had begun, but the war was only gaining momentum, and the sons of Fenrir had taken only the first, bloodiest step towards their goal. For Haakon, this unconquerable chieftain, the capture of St. Oldhelm's monastery would mark the beginning of a new Viking era. Century. Oldhelm's monastery, once a symbol of faith and tranquility for the Saxons, had now transformed into a citadel of Viking power, and its capture by the sons of Fenrir marked the beginning of meticulous preparations for further conquests. Haakon, fully understanding that this first victory was merely a part of a grand game, realized that the next step would be crucial for establishing dominance over Wessex. Control of the monastery gave the sons of Fenrir not only a military advantage, but also strategic leverage that would allow them to consolidate their positions and expand their influence. After seizing St. Oldhelm's, Haakon ordered the immediate fortification of the monastery. The sons of Fenrir understood that despite its advantageous location, the monastery alone could not provide reliable defense against a potential Saxon counterattack. The walls were reinforced with sturdy oak logs brought from nearby forests, and the surrounding fields were closely guarded. Traps were set along the paths and at the monastery's exits to ensure no enemy patrol could infiltrate unnoticed. Meanwhile, within the monastery walls, Viking warriors trained tirelessly. Haakon, maintaining his composure, observed their every movement, every exercise. He knew that their strength lay not only in numbers, but also in the strict discipline with which they carried out his orders. Combat training was exhausting. The sons of Fenrir practiced group attacks, tactical coordination, and hand-to-hand combat techniques daily. The spirit of unity among the warriors was stronger than ever. Each of them understood that their next target would not be an isolated monastery, but the very heart of Wessex, Edward's kingdom. Months passed, and as planned, the forces of Ubbe Ragnarsson, son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, began to arrive. Ubbe, possessing immense strength and an imposing reputation, brought with him battle-hardened warriors and the siege engines necessary for the later stages of the campaign. Their ships, laden to the brim with men and supplies, arrived in small groups to avoid drawing undue attention. Each vessel was carefully disguised in secluded coves and then pulled ashore. Ubbe, though not participating in the final battle, was to play a vital role. He was to ensure not only the preservation, but also the augmentation of the sons of Fenrir's strength. He brought with him treasures plundered during recent campaigns, which were planned to be used to attract new allies and maintain the morale and equipment of the troops. Furthermore, his masterful command of war machines, such as catapults and siege towers, was widely known. Ubbe's presence not only strengthened the sons of Fenrir's confidence, but also solidified their alliance with other Norse tribes who had sworn to aid in Edward's overthrow. Ubbe, with his imposing presence and fearless leadership, soon became a key figure in Haakon's plans. Having endured many battles and witnessed the fall of entire kingdoms, he understood that the siege of Wessex would require not only military might, but also cunning, patience, and a meticulously planned strategy. The two chieftains, Akin and Ubi, spent long hours discussing the next steps, developing the details of the impending attack, and allocating resources to eliminate any chance. Every step had to be precise to the last detail, for any error could lead to the loss of their hard-won advantage. During months of preparation, the sons of Fenrir also cemented alliances with other Viking groups and local clans. Northern tribes joined their cause, understanding that if Edward fell, the lands to the south would be open for further conquests. The sons of Fenrir hired not only warriors, but also mercenaries and even small groups discontented with Edward's rule. These were individuals who, for various reasons, saw the king's downfall as an opportunity to advance their careers in a new Viking government. These alliances were essential to ensure sufficient support for the siege of Wessex, both in numbers and resources. Viking scouts, deployed in the forests surrounding Wessex, returned with detailed reports on the kingdom's situation. They informed Akin about the morale of Edward's warriors, weaknesses in their defenses, and, crucially, the fortifications of Wessex. Akin began to realize that the Anglo-Saxon monarch, despite his power, had prioritized the expansion of his domains, neglecting some distant frontiers of his kingdom. This oversight could be exploited by the sons of Fenrir for their own purposes. As reinforcements led by Ubi arrived and his army grew stronger, Akin began secretly infiltrating his agents into Wessex. Spies, skillfully disguised as merchants, pilgrims, and peasants, operated within the kingdom, gathering valuable intelligence on internal politics and dissensions within Wessex itself. Many Anglo-Saxon aristocrats, especially those who ruled distant lands, expressed discontent with Edward's growing influence and his expansionist policies. Some were even willing to ally with the Vikings, believing that the king's strengthening would diminish their own influence. Akin, with his keen mind, began to identify a growing network of discontent within the kingdom. These internal divisions among the Anglo-Saxon nobility could become a trump card in the hands of the sons of Fenrir. Edward's fall could be hastened not only by military force, but also by undermining the trust of his own allies. In this case, the war transformed from a mere clash of swords into a battle for the hearts and minds of Edward's subjects. With the arrival of additional resources, weapons, and allies, Akin and Ubi focused their efforts on preparing for a large-scale siege. They began constructing siege towers and catapults, readying for a massive assault on the walls of Wessex. Simultaneously, supply routes were meticulously planned to ensure an uninterrupted provision of everything the Vikings needed during the offensive. The logistics of a siege of such magnitude demanded meticulous attention to detail, and Akin knew he could not afford to make a mistake. Meanwhile, the warriors of the sons of Fenrir continued to hone their skills and coordination. Akin, Uba, and their advisors regularly held meetings to adjust their strategy and ensure that all warriors were ready for the upcoming events. Edward's overthrow seemed increasingly real, and every action of the sons of Fenrir was aimed at making the blow to Wessex devastating and irreversible. The great assault on Wessex was close at hand. When all elements of the plan were ready, Ubi's troops, alliances with other Vikings, infiltrated spies, and siege engines, Akin was ready to strike. The Vikings were filled with determination, their strategies perfected, and the time had come to put an end to King Edward's reign. The decisive battle for Wessex was about to begin. Akin surveyed his troops and, in a surge of determination, raised his sword. He understood that not only the future of Wessex, but the fate of all England was at stake. His name, Akin, would echo through the ages, not just as the name of a Viking chieftain, but as the name of a man who changed the course of history. Preparing for the final step, the sons of Fenrir had to act decisively. The siege of Wessex was about to commence, and with it, a new era for the kingdom. The attack on Wessex was destined to be an event forever etched in the annals of history, not merely as a bloody slaughter, but as the downfall of an entire empire. Akin and his sons of Fenrir understood that this would be a turning point, marking the end of Edward's reign, the Anglo-Saxon monarch. The siege was prepared with meticulous precision, siege engines assembled, troops arrayed in battle formations, the battle plan clear and understood. But most important was the spirit of unity and the thirst for revenge that drove every Viking. The night before the attack was filled with an ominous silence, foreshadowing the storm. The warriors of the sons of Fenrir took positions on the hills surrounding Wessex, hidden in the shadows. The alliance with Ubbi Ragnarsson strengthened Akin's confidence in success, and he knew that with the first rays of dawn, the decisive battle would begin. At dawn, the Vikings launched their assault. Like thunder rending the sky, Akin's warriors crashed upon the city, letting out a ferocious cry. Archers and stone throwers led the attack, raining projectiles upon the city walls. The tension reached its peak, and the hail of arrows seemed endless. This was not just an attack, but a message. Wessex had fallen, and Edward was powerless to stop them. The sons of Fenrir were known for their ruthlessness, and the battle quickly escalated into a fierce hand-to-hand combat. The Vikings, armed with axes and swords, breached the Saxon defenses. Their onslaught was so swift that the ranks of Edward's warriors began to crumble. Catapults and siege towers, erected over months of preparation, rained down stones on Wessex's fortifications, tearing breaches in the walls and sowing chaos. While the battle raged at the walls, Akin's troops secured key positions around the city. The Viking chieftain skillfully directed his warriors, and the siege towers relentlessly advanced toward the gates of Wessex. The city, once an impregnable fortress, was now in the Vikings' grasp. With every step forward, Akin's forces drew closer to their desired victory. In the city gripped by anxiety, Edward and his commanders were in a state of deep disarray. News of the imminent attack reached the royal chambers, forcing Edward to hastily gather his army in hopes of repelling the impending siege. However, the Vikings, known for their ruthless tactics and brute force, advanced from all sides, like a relentless storm. Edward realized he could not hold out for long, especially given that Akin's forces swelled with each passing minute, like a tide ready to engulf everything in its path. The climax of the battle erupted when Ubbi's detachment stormed into Wessex's central square, plunging Edward's soldiers into chaos and confusion. The battlefield became a nightmarish scene of mass slaughter, where the bodies of fallen warriors covered the ground, while the Vikings, showing no mercy, continued their advance. Akin, mounted on a powerful steed, directed the battle with unwavering confidence. He closely monitored every move of his warriors, promptly adjusting strategy depending on the situation. His mind was focused on a single goal, the overthrow of Edward, the king who posed a threat to his homeland and his personal honor. Edward's forces were demoralized, and the Vikings, demonstrating unyielding resilience, reclaimed every inch of ground. The climax occurred in an epic clash at the walls of the royal palace. Edward, driven by desperation, seized his sword and rallied his most loyal companions around him to try and offer resistance to Akin. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the clang of colliding swords and axes, but the sons of Fenrir were an irresistible force. Despite all his bravery, Edward could not withstand the Viking onslaught. This was a battle not only for territory, but for the soul of Wessex, and Akin felt it in every fiber of his being. At a crucial moment, when Edward found himself surrounded by a dozen Vikings, Akin delivered the decisive blow. He charged forward alone, defying anyone who dared to stand in his way. The ensuing struggle was short, but furious. With a lightning-fast move, Akin disarmed Edward and plunged his sword into the king's chest. Edward's blood stained the sacred ground of Wessex, and the triumphant Vikings let out a deafening victory cry. Edward's death marked the end of an era. The Anglo-Saxon king, who sought to expand his dominions and subjugate the Vikings, had fallen, and his kingdom was overthrown. A king, kneeling before the body of the fallen monarch, stood still, surveying the empire he had just conquered. There was no exultation on his face, only a sense of duty fulfilled. This was the price he and his men had paid for overthrowing Edward and seizing the kingdom. After Edward's demise, Wessex came under the control of the sons of Fenrir. The city was plundered, and its treasures and riches became the spoils of the Vikings. The terrified Saxon populace was forced to submit to their new rulers. Aiken, despite his victory, understood that this conquest was merely the beginning. The kingdom of Wessex now belonged to the Vikings, but the future remained uncertain. While his warriors celebrated their victory, Aiken gazed into the distance. His eyes swept over the conquered city, and his thoughts returned to the distant lands yet to be conquered, to the enemies yet to be faced. The path of the sons of Fenrir was far from over, and many roads lay ahead, full of trials and new battles. But at that moment, the kingdom of Wessex lay at the feet of the sons of Fenrir, and Aiken knew that the future was in his hands. They had overthrown a king, toppled an empire, and now prepared for new challenges. The story of Aiken and his sons of Fenrir was not yet fully written. A new journey awaited, but that is another tale. And so, with Edward's fall and the capture of Wessex, the sons of Fenrir entered a new era, forged from steel, courage, and indomitable Viking strength.